So next up we have Louisa D Pearce. Louisa is going to present on when hospitals become home, working with trauma and transference to enable healing during hospital admissions. Louisa D Pearce is a consumer consultant from HealthScope and is based in the Victoria Clinic in Melbourne, where she provides peer support, group facilitation, training and advocacy. She is continually engaged in her own recovery and is an author of a memoir, The Little Girl That Nobody Wanted. So, welcome, Louisa.
Thank you. And slides, do I just
Just the big green button.
Big green button. Excellent. I like things simple. Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to this session on the end of Thursday. I was reflecting today that I have been so institutionalised by my time in hospital that when I come to a venue like this and I see hooks in the bathroom cubicles, I go, oh, there's a place to hang my bag. So it was just a little something I wanted to share with you, because hospital really has been a home for me for many, many, many admissions. I've absolutely lost count now, but I started going in 2010 when I fell acutely unwell, and I've used it as one of my healing tools. And I know so many people have negative experiences of being in hospitals. I have to say first up that it's private, which I think makes a big difference when I talk to people. Emergency departments in public hospitals have helped me a lot, but my stays have been in private, and so I've had personal experience of being a patient many, many times and using it as my home. And then I work now in one of the hospitals where I used to be a patient, and so I see this phenomenon a lot happening of patients who have awful lives on the outside in a lot of ways, you know, so many huge problems that they're facing, and to come in and find sanctuary. And in some cases it's a really helpful thing, and in some cases it's not, because it's kind of stalling their progress, and it creates all sorts of interesting transference issues from both the patient and the people that are working with that person. So I thought I'd just address some of these gnarlier kind of issues today in my talk. In my last presentation I made way too many slides. I got to about a quarter of them, so I don't know how we're going to go here, but I'll make sure I leave some question time, because that's usually the most interesting thing. Right. So hospital's about medical service provision, right? Well, I hope you can all see this. I do a lot of art when I was unwell, and I still use it in my recovery. And one time when I was getting a little bit up close and personal with my doctor and his boundaries, he sort of got a bit nervous and said, "I'm just providing a medical service." And so I drew this picture to depict what I felt I needed, which was care and protection. And you can probably guess from this picture that my background is attachment trauma and a history of childhood trauma. So not in a horrific, big capital T trauma way, just more attachment and perhaps some emotional problems, missing connection with caregivers. Yeah. So this was very important to me, that he understood this and that he was going to be able to take on the role of reparenting. Fortunately, this particular doctor was really open to it, and even though I was desperately ashamed of the fact that I needed this kind of care in my mid-30s, I'm an adult, I shouldn't need parental care, I should be all grown up. Part of the problem with attachment disorders is that parts of you aren't grown up. So he very kindly rephrased my attachment issues as positive attachment to him. So he made it okay, he normalised it for me, and fortunately he had a really good understanding of the therapeutic alliance that's needed in these cases. I know it's not the same for all doctors. So my medical picture on sort of arrival of the first big breakdown, age 36, those were some of the things that probably would have been written in my notes, maybe even using more clinical language than that. And through the lens of the medical model, these symptoms were the problem. But through the lens of a trauma model, the symptoms were the signs of the problem. And the problem was really this. So unmet needs from childhood, toxic, I put negative, but they were toxic core beliefs, trauma history, that's not just through family of origin, that was bullying, that was immigration, that was, you know, the life story that follows so many of us around, dissociated from my real feelings, exhaustion, exhausted nervous system, chronic stress response, and attachment trauma. So in the medical model, I really had to fight to get these real issues addressed. Everybody wanted to treat the symptoms, everybody wanted to give me medication, but yeah, like I didn't even know what the real issues were at this point. So it's a real, you know, I'm hoping in the future that trauma-informed care will just be the lens that all clinicians can see through to help people. Because I was originally given a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and that's not traditionally associated with trauma. So, I mean, there's a lot of literature that says it is, but just in terms of your general frontline person, it's drugs. It was only when I got borderline personality disorder diagnosis, that was when I started to get the proper trauma therapy that I needed. This came out of my art, and the reason I ended up getting the trauma therapy was through my artistic protests. This was a complaint that Dr. O was too cold, too unavailable, and this was very, very triggering for me because this was how I felt about my relationship with my father. So, you know, Dr. O became dad, and Dr. O didn't really want to be dad. We've got a really good relationship now. He's actually a colleague, so we've had plenty of chance to unpack this and understand what was going on. Unfortunately for me, he picked up what was happening and he realised how to respond, you know, appropriately. This is just another picture which shows the many different aspects of myself that were childish and were needing help, and that is Dr. O on the end there. And those are all the different parts of me. I'm kind of going to scoot through these because I learnt my lesson in the last talk. So I can send you the slides afterwards if you're interested in the pictures. Sorry if this triggers anybody, but I think it's so important when we're talking about trauma. The things that are labelled acting out, you know, really are expressions of need for help and loving attention, and the desire to punish myself for not being good. So if Dr. O was dad and I perceived that I'd done something wrong or he was rejecting me, which is pretty easy to perceive because a lot of doctors will literally spend a couple of minutes with you and that's it. And imagine if your father spent that amount of time with a child, you'd be devastated. So I would wait my 24 hours and sometimes longer for Dr. O to appear for 2 minutes. And then he'd leave again, you know. This was the inner world that I was living in that no one could see, and it was such a painful place. And in the 2 minutes I felt happy and loved and cared for, and in the rest of the time, abandoned, rejected. Thus a lot of self-harm was actually, in a way, iatrogenic. It was created by the very, you know, interaction with the doctor. Another illustration to depict it, you know, those strong attachments that formed became very toxic, creating terror of abandonment, paranoid fear of rejection, unworthiness and shame. And this is a picture to depict when my poor doctor went on holiday. So, yeah. And another one there, I couldn't get into hospital because of a policy. Some red tape issue came up and created a lot of pain for me. So, am I just some weirdo with self-indulgent needs? I asked myself this for years. You know, it was always about me. Like I always thought there's something wrong with me. But I think really that trauma is everywhere, and we've probably heard that a lot in this conference, and hopefully many people in this room are aware of the prevalence of trauma and how it's not necessary. You know, I was an obvious case of trauma. I had obvious attachment issues. I was acting them out, I was showing them in pictures. But a lot of people that I meet, I can see the same dynamics, the same struggles inside them, but they're not actually sharing it. And a lot of trauma is unreported. So, people may not disclose unless specifically asked, may not remember any childhood trauma, might hide because of shame, and may not even identify experiences as being traumatic. So I was one of these kids that had like the happy family, have to put the quote marks around it because it all seemed rosy in my memory until I started to explore this stuff in therapy and realised that I was a very unhappy child. So one lady, if anyone hasn't heard of Dr. Sandra Bloom and creating sanctuary model, has anyone here heard of that? So do check her out. She's amazing. I love it when psychiatrists do this kind of grassroots work. Her and a team of colleagues over in the States had the great fortune of designing an inpatient unit from scratch, and they designed it through the lens of trauma-informed care and working with trauma and attachment. And her books go into, in depth, the challenges that came with that, the transference issues that arose from it, and how the staff had to really look at themselves, because I think part of the problem with trauma attachment is that staff have been trained to be very neutral, and sometimes they can act or even robotic, don't get involved. I mean, I've even heard staff saying things like, don't talk to her because she's borderline and she'll just enmesh you in her problems. So that's a massive problem, because people who are experiencing those attachment traumas, we need to be talked to. We need to resolve our issues relationally with therapeutic alliances. And so, yes, it can be very, very difficult and challenging. And I now work as a peer worker, so I work with a lot of those people who are in those positions too, who are getting very attached to me, who see me as an attachment figure. But because I understand what I needed, I think I'm able to help them a whole lot better. And what I needed was really, really simple. Kindness and gentleness, and a lot of it's in tone of voice and body language and how I'm spoken to, and consideration of my needs. Just really basic things which I think when you've got a trauma hat on become obvious, but if you're not thinking that way, it's like if a nurse would say, I'll come back in 5 minutes, and 2 hours would pass. If I was a 5-year-old, that is abandonment. That's feels like death. To someone with an attachment trauma, it feels like death. So I would be crawling the walls, I'd be hurting myself, I'd be whatever. And then the nurse would be like, what's the big deal? So understanding attachment trauma, I think, is so important. Anyway, so Dr. Sandra Bloom, on the last slide, do look her work up, because she really understood this and she was able to create a service which helped people in that way. And we know that trauma is everywhere. We've seen a lot of slides like this throughout the conference, so I won't bore you too much, but the single most significant predictor that an individual will end up in the mental health system is a history of childhood trauma. So it is everywhere, even if not seen obviously. So how can we best help people with trauma? So this was my kind of conception of it's a kind of a mix of the current system and what we need to focus on in a way. So I made it like an iceberg. Our medical treatments are just the tip of the iceberg. So the surface stuff that we're giving people, the clinical treatment, which is usually the medications, the bricks and mortar of the hospital, the therapy, that's just the tip. From there, we've got structure, and this is where the idea of home starts to kind of creep in, because we've got a place, a refuge, we've got routine, we've got toolboxes, as in, tools on how to cope. We're getting taught stuff. So that becomes something that we can take away with us as well. Even more important though, underneath that is setting this foundation of relationship to others. Because in attachment trauma, that's what's been damaged. It was never a strong connection which gave you a strong internal sense of self. Now that can be rebuilt. I'm living testimony to having a secure attachment with the therapeutic people that I've worked with, who have taken on, in my opinion, the most massive responsibility to look after me at that level, to basically be my second parents. I can't thank those people more deeply for that job. And that's where forming secure attachments with those people has allowed me to grow up so that I have a secure attachment with myself. And that is the foundation there that I've kind of depicted there, which is the relationship to self, the ability to self-soothe, have self-compassion, and to feel empowered, like I can do this. Because when you're working with someone with attachment trauma, there is a lot of victimhood that comes with it. I'm powerless. And that's because part of them is still stuck in that powerless child consciousness. So we have to help them grow that up, just as if we were parenting them. I took a bit of decided to be really honest here and distill what I think are the elements of true healing, the fundaments of healing, and to use the L word, which, I'm starting to hear heard in practice, and it's really encouraging. That love is so important. Love, it doesn't have to mean that my psychiatrist says I love you, even though I'd love him to say that. But I know he does. We read each other's energy. We know when someone cares about us. And we don't have to say those words. We can imbue that, and we can give that to someone anyway. And that's the roots that hold us down, like in that picture. And then that creates the freedom to grow strong and tall and be your own person. And when I did this drawing, I thought, this looks a lot like parenting. Anyone have children here? Yeah? Love, the foundation, trying to work towards giving them ultimate freedom so they can be their own person. Interesting. Now, I see some problems in the system at the moment, that we have problems with most treatment plans, is that there's a fear of love, that there's a fear of feelings and of crossing boundaries, and like that comment I heard that I told you about just a moment ago about don't talk to the person with the borderline because you'll get enmeshed. Well, that's fear of getting close to someone, fear of being human even. And then that's the training. I'm not sort of picking on that person. I'm just saying that there's a lot of training and indoctrination that causes us to feel that fear. And then we've got the fear of freedom, the fear of giving the patients freedom, fear of them making mistakes, fear of madness, fear of that dark times of distress when it looks like everything's going to go horribly wrong, and we don't want the worst thing to happen, but we need to allow the freedom to respect everybody's sovereign journey. Otherwise they can't grow. So it's a real combination, and I think there's a lot of fear in our systems of both of those things. Judith Herman, in her book Models of Recovery, sorry I can't remember the title, it's in the references, traumatic events, essentially, it doesn't matter what the trauma is, they violate the autonomy of the person. So in my view, trauma-informed care must ultimately seek to reinstate the autonomy of the person. That's what we have to work towards. Now, we can't do that for a person. We can't make someone be powerful, but we can provide the space, the encouragement, everything that they need. And I've had my freedom taken away by my doctor and my husband, the people closest to me, who take one look at me and go, this is what you need. And I know that there are times when I've needed that. I've needed my freedom to be taken away. But those same two people know exactly when to give it back to me. And it isn't a long time span. They've got to let me learn to trust myself. And so that's been part of my recovery journey. Has anyone heard of Cartman's drama triangle? Yeah, great, one person. It might be a little old now. Yeah, hi, good. I just find it really useful. It's this dynamic that gets happening with transference, where it's conceived as a triangle where people get stuck in a relationship. One person becomes a victim, Another person tries to maybe rescue them, so they each take on the role. And then sooner or later, what will happen is the rescuer will get sick of trying to rescue the victim and become a perpetrator. So they'll get annoyed and start to persecute. Or the victim will start to persecute the rescuer. And so this kind of dance happens where you kind of navigate the three corners of the triangle. I see this happening a lot in hospitals when patients take on victim roles. They imagine that everyone is persecuting them. And I also see sometimes the staff actually genuinely persecuting because they're so frustrated. And they may not be necessarily saying it outright, but it's done in body language, tone, punitive actions, whatever it might be, subtle things. So I do see this happening. Now Cartman had, or it wasn't actually Cartman, it was another writer, sorry, I can't remember the reference now, but you can look up what's called the drama triangle solution, which I think is more empowering. And that is to just change the roles slightly, to just think about them a little bit differently. So the victim becomes a creator. And that's what we want to encourage our patients to become. That's what I've had to become. I've had to take charge of my recovery journey and create my own recovery path. The persecutor becomes the challenger. So when you feel really stuck with someone and frustrated, rather than persecuting, which is often a passive-aggressive type behaviour, because we don't outwardly want to persecute anybody, right? It's just to think of yourself as, okay, I'm going to challenge this person. I'm going to perhaps throw a question that's going to make them think about their responsibility in this. And then rescuer, and this is the place hopefully where most of us would sit when we're working with people, is to be the coach. You know, we can't rescue people, we can't save them from their own victimhood, but we can encourage, I like that word coach, you know, it's like, come on, you can do it. Believing in them, encouraging them, praising them when they do something really great. Just kind of walking alongside, which I guess is what coaches do. Maybe just leave you with this thought, which is, you know, to trust the process, that mental distress is not to be feared, it's to be integrated and transformed. It's a stage that some of us go through. It's an extremely dark period, but I don't see it as sickness that should be eradicated, or an aberration of the human experience, or I don't see it as those things. I see it as a process, like a dark night of the soul, which is actually a healing journey, and if allowed to be, if cultivated, if fostered, it can lead to incredible healing. I have come out of my experiences of mental distress stronger, more authentic, 100% happier. Like, I was such a facade before all of this, pretending everything was okay, and now I can honestly say everything's okay. So I will open it up to questions now. Thanks.
Have we got any questions for Louisa?
If you don't, I'll go back on those slides. Warning.
Hi, my name's John. Mm-hmm. I want to thank you for the presentation. There's so much that I can relate to. The handing autonomy across and back. In the 1990s in Sheffield in England, in their mental health services, people were issued with a yellow card and they handed it over, and they determined when it would be handed back. So there was this physical handing over of the card and passing it back. I think it's because they play soccer or something. But that was the first time I heard about this handing over and handing back. And it was one of the things that helped me a lot, because there were some times previous in my life where I just couldn't be responsible. Someone else had to. But then it had to be handed back. And at a time that I determined. So that was the only comment I wanted to make, apart from thanking you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. What a great idea. I like that idea, actually. I'm not sure it's not everybody's cup of tea. That's the whole point of all this diversity, right? We can choose if it works for you, if it doesn't. But I like the idea of making it tangible. Well, the only equivalent I've got in my life is box of pills at home, handing it over to my husband, and then I get it back when I'm safe. So, but there is power in that when I think about it, like actually making it tangible. Yes, because so much of the stuff we talk about is intangible. So that's lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions from the floor for Louisa?
I have a thought. You spoke about someone walking alongside you in a journey of recovery, so to speak, in a coaching parlance. It occurs to me that very act is something that is exquisitely difficult for anyone to do who cares about someone who wants to rescue them. And I just wonder whether you recall anyone who had difficulty with that in your journey with that dichotomy.
Yeah, how do you walk alongside somebody and, I don't know, and it doesn't matter, I guess, it makes a difference if you're a professional working with them or if you're a carer or a family member, but it's just as difficult, right, sometimes. Look, sometimes we had to, communication, I guess, in a nutshell, like communicate about it. And a practical thing that I did was a safety plan with my husband and a worker. That was really interesting because when we did that safety plan, it opened up a whole bunch of conversations about how my husband felt in this role as carer that I hadn't been considering, because of course when you're so mentally distressed, you're just like, it's me, me, me. I mean, that's how it is, you're just in total survival mode. So for me to kind of realise that this was just killing him, like he was so worried about me and etc., that was a big wake-up call. So I did that. In my practice with the other example that springs to mind is not my own distress. I've worked as a peer worker for a while now too. And I have to navigate that space with people as well. And I remember one person that went on a 40-day water fast and looked like she was going to fall over and die. Like, I was so worried about her, and she hadn't told anybody, and she wasn't connected with services, and it was just one of those awful situations. And so we negotiated. I pulled out my IPS training, intentional peer support training. We talk a lot about sitting with distress in intentional peer support. We talk a lot about negotiation. We would never do something to somebody without their knowledge. If you can't, consent first, but if you can't get that, they must know what you're doing. You cannot deceive people and not be transparent, because that in itself is a trauma. So we had to do quite a lot of negotiation, and what we did is we came up with a plan where I was happy and she was happy, and that was that she promised to go, because I was ready to call the CAT team. I'm like, you need to be in hospital, this is very serious. And she said no, and I said, all right, well, what else can you do that would make me feel happier about this, and we can find a common ground. And so she agreed to go and see her GP that day, and she gave me her GP's phone number and her flatmate's phone number, and I rang both of those people. So that was just one example of like negotiating where I could relax as well. Sharing
the power in the relationship. In the IPS principles.
Yes, because if I'd have just jumped in and called the CAT team, I would have damaged our relationship greatly. Probably traumatised her far worse than, because if somebody doesn't want that, like, I'm not against CAT teams. I've actually called them many times. I'm the kind of person that wants to get into services and is knocking an emergency going, let me in. But she was like, don't let me anywhere near services. So respecting the other person and really good communication and good negotiation. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Sam. Thank you for sharing your beautiful art, and very personal, but really powerful, so much appreciated. I had a question. You mentioned that you were lucky in a way. I hope you feel that way, that you were in private facilities. And yeah, I guess I was just curious, without wanting to put any pressure on you, of course, about transforming the public health system completely. But what invitations or recommendations, I suppose, would you give sort of public inpatient facilities to sort of start a transformation so that people would possibly feel some of that restorative and therapeutic kind of environment within those contexts as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I didn't talk an awful lot about the hospital itself in this talk, which was the title of the slide, so forgive me. It was a home for me because it was a sanctuary and it's safe. And so a couple of things spring to mind that were critical in that. Continuity of care, which I don't think happens so much in public. So whenever I go to my hospital, I pretty much walk headlong into a hug from someone, one of the nurses that knows me, or, you know, a lot of the patients come back again and again. So it tends to form a kind of community. I've had the same doctor for many years. Yeah, so familiarity and those sorts of aspects are important. It is voluntary, right? So you're there because, well, you might not want to be there necessarily, but you have chosen on some level to be there. So that's a massive difference as well. We have in the private system a really awesome therapy programs in most private hospitals that I know of. Our one where I work is really good. Like, we have, you know, probably 4 or 5 groups a day, including craft groups and, you know, relaxing social groups. And we have the psych ed groups, we have gardening groups, we have drumming groups. So there's just so much to do. Really good art therapy as well. So those things are important too. So people aren't just sort of sitting around bored and, you know, feeling awful. Aesthetically, the private hospitals are a little bit better. I mean, I do have to say, believe, I don't think they're ideal. Like, I've often fantasized, okay, you know, what's my ideal place to recover and get well? And it's probably in the country somewhere with some vegetable patches and chickens and, you know, yoga, and I don't know, it looks more like that. But I've made the most of what I've got in the private system, and the private system isn't doing too badly in my opinion. Yeah, so those are probably the critical differences. I talk more about what's positive in private, but you can imagine then the flip side in public, that's not the case, you know. So many involuntary patients. How can it ever be therapeutic if it's involuntary? I just don't see how those two concepts can connect, ever. So, yeah, but I mean, not everyone in public is involuntary. So, and I do know people that, you know, have found some benefit from that stage too. So, yeah, you can't sort of whitewash everything. But yeah, I hope that explains it a little.
I just wanted to make a comment. You had your okay, so it was the iceberg picture, and for me it was really striking that it's actually Maslow's hierarchy of needs upside down.
I noticed that too.
I guess
I'll go back to it.
As part of PCLI we're about to start developing new services, and that was really something striking to me to think, okay, I want to turn this upside down. Like, I want to think about that when we're thinking about how to provide those new services. So that was just really poignant for me. Thank you.
Definitely read Sandra Bloom then. Creating Sanctuary. She's written several other books. She's now got this whole thing called the Sanctuary Model. So, yeah, she would agree with most of that there. Yeah, I mean, we heal in relationship. And then once we've healed in relationship, once we feel safe and we belong, as you say, with Maslow's hierarchy of need, once we've got that need taken care of, we can blossom as our own person, and we can be resilient and stand on our own 2 feet, which is kind of the stage I'm at now. So I'm very grateful to all of those relationships. Yeah. And, you know, even in the restrictive, if you work in a really restrictive setting where things are not ideal, and we haven't, you know, most of us do, I guess, still, the relationship is still there. We still have moments with people, we still have presence with people. I have had some of my trauma behaviours, like sitting and rocking, sitting on the floor and rocking. I've had that punished by nurses. I've been told that that's silly, get off the floor, and I've had the opposite. I've had someone come and rub my back, and that's been so therapeutic. So the little therapeutic interactions that we can all have with people count for, those are the things that I remember, the little stepping stones in my healing journey, are the moments that I've shared with people that have looked after me. And that doesn't matter what setting you're in, you can still do that. Yeah.
Hi, John again.
Yes.
Over the years, my involvement in the mental health consumer movement brings me to ask you this question, but in the context, is it the big difference between public and private? Public, you get treatment. Private, you're likely to get a therapy. In public, the assumption is that therapy goes on after treatment. So once you're discharged from the acute inpatient unit, that's when therapy starts. That's the systemic rationalisation of itself. But the question I have is, there are assumptions that the private system isn't as coercive as the public system, but my experience of contacting with thousands of consumers is that the threat of medication non-compliance is that if you don't take your medication in the private system, we'll send you to the public and they'll make you take it. So that component of the private system is just as coercive.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced that sort of coercion in the private? Okay.
Yes, I have. We call it the stick. It's a massive problem. Part of me would love to do research on that or something, like the grey zone of, because we've got lots of numbers on people on CTOs, but how many people are not on CTOs but really are on CTOs? Like, I find that really interesting and worrying and everything at the same time. Look, I'm the first to admit I have privilege of being able to articulate myself. Although at times I was completely mute and so distressed that all I could do was make pictures, but I still managed to communicate my needs. And so I've managed to wheedle my way out, if you like, of those situations, and find a way to make the system work. I just wish it wasn't so hard for people, and I don't want people to have to wheedle their way out or fight like I've done, or sit down and have really difficult conversations with doctors about, can you please say goodbye to me when you leave the room, because it really hurts when you just walk out, or can you please spend more than 2 minutes with me? So I'd love to see a system where everybody becomes so much more aware of these things, and where that issue that you just raised, thank you for raising it, is talked about, because it isn't talked about at the moment in where I'm working. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.